After she pays for my trip, I'll throw her in a nursing home. I heard my daughter say it in a voice so casual, so certain, it didn't even sound cruel to her anymore. Just practical, like she was planning a grocery list or deciding what to wear next weekend. And for a moment I thought I must have misheard, that my ears, at 68, were finally starting to betray me, but I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't make a sound as I stood in the hallway outside her kitchen, my hand still wrapped around the envelope that held the deposit for the trip she had insisted we take together, the trip she had called our chance to reconnect. And I waited, hoping there would be more, something that would explain it, soften it, undo it. But instead I heard her laugh, light and easy, followed by Brian's voice, lower, uncertain, asking something I couldn't quite make out. And then Vanessa again, sharper this time. Relax, it's not like she'll fight it. She can barely keep up with things as it is. And that was when something inside me shifted, not breaking, not shattering, but settling into a kind of stillness I hadn't felt before, like a glass of water finally going flat after being shaken too many times. And I realized I wasn't shocked because I didn't understand what she meant. I was shocked because I understood it perfectly, every word, every intention, every quiet plan that had been forming behind smiles and Sunday dinners and carefully chosen gifts. And I stayed there a few seconds longer, long enough to hear a chair scrape against the floor, long enough to know if I stayed any longer I might give myself away. So I stepped back, slow and deliberate, my shoes silent against the hardwood, and walked to the front door as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just overheard my own future being negotiated like an inconvenience. And when I stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have for early spring, sharp enough to make my eyes water, though I told myself it was just the wind, just the temperature, just anything but what I was actually feeling. And I stood there on the porch of the house I had helped my daughter buy, the house I had painted with her, cleaned for her, babysat. And while she built her life, and I looked down at the envelope in my hand, the one with the check already written, the one she was counting on, and for a long moment I considered walking back in, handing it to her, pretending I had heard nothing, because that was what I had always done, chosen peace over confrontation, chosen her comfort over my own questions. But then I thought about the way she had said it, not angry, not emotional, just certain, and I understood something I should have understood a long time ago, that this wasn't a moment, it was a plan, and I had just walked into it halfway through. And for the first time in years, I decided I wasn't going to ask her what she meant. I was going to find out exactly what she had already put in motion, and I would do it quietly, the same way she had. Because if there was one thing age had given me, it wasn't weakness, it was patience. And I had a feeling she had underestimated just how much of it I had left. I had always believed that love in a family was measured in quiet things, in the meals you cooked without being asked, in the bills you covered without keeping score, in the way you showed up even when no one noticed. And for most of my life, I had lived that belief without questioning it, especially when it came to Vanessa, because after her father passed away 8 years ago, she was all I had left that felt like home. And I told myself that helping her was not a sacrifice. It was simply what a mother does, even when it meant dipping into savings I had promised myself I would protect, even when it meant putting off repairs on my own house, even when it meant saying yes before I had fully understood what I was agreeing to. Because Vanessa had always known how to ask in a way that made it sound like she was doing me a favor, like including me was a kindness, not a convenience. And I let myself believe that, over and over again, because it was easier than asking whether I was being used. And in the weeks leading up to that trip, everything about her behavior had felt almost too perfect, like a version of my daughter I remembered from years ago, warmer, more attentive, calling me just to check in, stopping by with small things she said reminded her of me, asking if I was comfortable traveling, if I needed anything new, if I felt ready for a break. And I had noticed it. Of course I had. But I had chosen to see it as growth, as maturity, as the natural softening that comes with age and motherhood, not as something rehearsed, not as something with an agenda behind it. And when she first suggested the trip, she had framed it as something we deserved, a few days by the coast, somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, a place where we could spend time together without distractions. And I remember feeling something loosen in my chest when she said that, because I had missed her in ways I had never admitted out loud, missed the version of us that used to talk for hours over coffee, that used to laugh without effort, that used to feel like we were on the same side of the world, and I wanted that back badly enough that I did not question the details. Not when she mentioned that flights had gone up in price. Not when she said it would be easier if I just handled the booking. Not when she hesitated slightly before telling me how much the deposit would be, and I told myself it made sense, that I was the one with more flexible time, that I was the one who had always managed things like this, that it was easier for me to take care of it, and I ignored the small flickers of doubt that surfaced each time the numbers felt higher than expected, each time the plan shifted just slightly, each time Brian stayed quiet when money was mentioned, stirring his coffee instead of offering to help, and I ignored the way Vanessa would change the subject just a little too quickly whenever I asked for specifics, because I did not want to disrupt the fragile feeling that maybe, just maybe, my daughter was choosing me again, and now, standing outside my own home earlier that day, replaying her words over and over in my mind, I could see those moments differently, not as coincidences, not as misunderstandings, but as pieces of something deliberate, something patient, something that had been building while I was busy convincing myself that everything was fine, and the realization did not come with anger the way I would have expected. It came with a kind of clarity that felt almost cold, like looking at a photograph where everything suddenly comes into focus all at once, and you cannot unsee what was always there. And I understood then that the trip was never about reconnecting. It was about positioning, about timing, about making sure I would step willingly into something I did not fully understand. And the hardest part was not that she had planned it. It was that she had planned it knowing exactly who I was, knowing exactly how I would respond, knowing that I would say yes, that I would trust her, that I would not question her intentions. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized that the person she had built that plan around was not the mother she loved. It was the mother she believed she could control, and I stood there for a long moment with that truth, letting it settle, letting it take its place alongside everything else I had overlooked. And when I finally went back inside later that evening, I did not confront her. I did not ask questions. I did not even look at her differently. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that she was not the only one capable of pretending, and this time, I intended to learn exactly how far her plan went before I made my move. The next morning arrived too quietly, the kind of quiet that used to comfort me, but now felt like a warning I could not ignore. And I followed my routine as I always did, measuring out coffee grounds, waiting for the machine to hum to life, watching the light shift across the kitchen counter as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And when Vanessa called just after 9, her voice was bright, almost cheerful, asking if I had thought more about the travel dates, if I preferred the earlier flight or the one closer to noon. I could hear the careful lightness in her tone, the way she was guiding the conversation without making it obvious. And for the first time I listened to her not as her mother, but as someone observing from a distance, noticing the pauses, the small hesitations, the way she avoided specifics while sounding completely confident. And I answered her the same way I always would have, calm, agreeable, giving nothing away, because I understood now that any change in me would only make her adjust her approach, and I needed her to believe that I was exactly who she thought I was, someone predictable, someone trusting, someone easy to lead. And later that afternoon I drove over to her house, the same one I had helped her furnish piece by piece, the same one where every corner still held traces of things I had chosen for her. And when I walked in, she greeted me with a hug that lasted just a second longer than usual, as if she was trying to reassure herself of something. And Brian was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone, offering me a polite smile, but not much else. And I noticed how quickly he glanced at Vanessa when I mentioned the trip, like he was waiting for her to respond. First, like he already knew what should and should not be said, and we sat down together, going over what she called the final details, though I realized there were still too many gaps for something that was supposed to be finalized, and she slid a printed itinerary across the table, pointing to places we would visit, restaurants she had selected, activities she thought I would enjoy, and it all looked thoughtful on the surface, carefully curated, almost generous. But when I asked about the payment breakdown, her finger paused for just a fraction of a second before she smiled, and said it would be easier if I handled the deposit and the first portion, and she would take care of the rest later. And I nodded as if that made perfect sense, even though I could see Brian stiffen slightly, his hand tightening around his coffee mug, And in that small reaction, I found confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect, that he was not entirely comfortable with this, but not willing to challenge it either. And as Vanessa continued talking, filling the space with enthusiasm, I let my eyes move around the room, taking in details I had stopped noticing over the years, the new furniture that had appeared without explanation, the upgraded appliances, the subtle signs of a lifestyle that had grown more expensive than she ever admitted. And I thought about the questions she had asked me over the past few months, about my savings, about my house, about whether I had ever considered downsizing, and how I had answered them without hesitation, believing I was simply sharing with my daughter, not realizing I was providing information that could be used to map out my future without my consent. And when Sophie came running into the room, wrapping her arms around me, calling me grandma with that same innocent excitement, I felt a brief flicker of something softer, a reminder of why I had always chosen to overlook everything else. But even that moment felt different now, not less real, but surrounded by a context I could no longer ignore. And as I sat there at the table, listening to Vanessa outline plans she had already decided for both of us, I understood that this was no longer about a trip. It was about control, about shaping what came next in my life without ever asking me if I agreed. And the most unsettling part was not how far she was willing to go. It was how certain she was that I would let her. And as I smiled back at her, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions, I made a quiet decision that I would not interrupt her, not yet, because every word she said, every detail she revealed, was another piece of the truth I was assembling. And this time, I intended to see the entire picture before I let her know I had been looking all along. That night, after I returned home, I did not turn on the television or reach for a book the way I usually did to fill the silence. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad I had not used in years, the kind I once kept for grocery lists and reminders, and I began writing down everything I could remember, not just from that day, but from the past several months, every comment Vanessa had made, every question she had asked, every small moment that had felt slightly off, but not enough for me to stop and question it at the time. And as I wrote, the pattern became impossible to ignore, the way she had started asking about my finances more directly, not in a concerned tone, but in a curious one, how much I still had saved, whether I had adjusted anything since her father passed, whether I had ever considered consolidating accounts to make things easier. And I had answered her openly, even gratefully, thinking she was taking an interest in my well-being, not realizing she was collecting information piece by piece. And then there were the conversations about my house, how she would stand in the doorway and look around as if she was seeing it differently than before, commenting on how much work it must be for one person, how the stairs might become difficult eventually, how a smaller place might be more practical. And I had laughed those comments off at the time, brushing them aside as the natural concern of a daughter thinking about the future. But now, written down in front of me, they did not feel like concern, they felt like preparation, like she had been mapping out not just my finances, but my living situation, identifying what could be changed, what could be taken over, what could be justified as being in my best interest. And I paused for a moment, pen hovering over the page, as I remembered a conversation from 3 months ago, one that had seemed so insignificant then that I had almost forgotten it entirely. Vanessa had asked if I had ever looked into long-term care options. She had said it casually, like it was something she had read about online, something she thought might be worth discussing just in case. And I had told her I was not ready for that kind of conversation, that I was still perfectly capable of taking care of myself. And she had smiled, nodded, and dropped the subject immediately, or at least that was what I had believed. But now I could see that she had not dropped it at all. She had simply moved it somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere I would not notice. And as I continued writing, more details surfaced, the time she had offered to help me organize my documents, suggesting it would be good to have everything in one place, the time she had asked if I had someone listed as my medical decision maker, the way she had reacted when I told her I had not updated anything since her father passed. There had been a flicker of something in her expression then, something I had not recognized, but now I understood it clearly. It had been interest, not concern, and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the pages in front of me, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me, because for the first time, I was not reacting to what she was saying in the moment. I was seeing the full timeline, the slow deliberate way she had built this plan without ever making it obvious, without ever giving me a reason to question her intentions, and I realized that if I had not overheard that one sentence, I might have continued exactly as I had been, trusting her, supporting her, stepping willingly into whatever came next, believing it was for my own good. And that thought did not make me angry the way I might have expected. It made me careful, because it meant that whatever she was planning, she believed it would work, she believed I would not resist, and that kind of confidence only comes from preparation, from having already taken steps I had not yet uncovered. And I closed the notepad slowly, placing my hand on top of it as if to steady myself, not because I felt overwhelmed, but because I understood that I was no longer dealing with assumptions. I was dealing with something real, something structured, something that had been in motion long before I realized it. And as the house around me settled into its usual nighttime stillness, I made another quiet decision. I would not confront her with what I knew, not yet, because what I had written down was only the beginning. And if she had been planning this for months, then there were pieces I had not seen, conversations I had not heard, actions I had not yet traced, and this time, I was not going to stop at suspicion. I was going to follow every detail until I understood exactly what she intended to do, and exactly how she planned to do it. The following day I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already begun working before my eyes opened, moving through details with a kind of quiet precision I had not used in years, and instead of reaching for my phone or lingering in bed, I got up, dressed, and drove to the bank just after it opened, choosing a time when the lobby would still be calm, when conversations could happen without interruption. And as I sat across from the account manager, someone who had known me for nearly a decade, I spoke in a tone that felt steady, almost detached, asking simple questions at first about my accounts, about recent activity, about access permissions. And I watched carefully as she pulled up the records, turning the screen slightly so I could see, and nothing looked alarming on the surface, no missing funds, no unauthorized transactions. But that was not what I was looking for. I was looking for patterns, for small changes, for signs that someone had been preparing for something beyond a single expense. And when I asked about linked profiles or secondary access, she paused, just briefly, before explaining that there had been a request made a few weeks earlier to add an authorized contact, not full access, but someone who could receive information if needed. And my hands remained still in my lap, even as my thoughts sharpened. And I asked who had made the request, and she told me it had come through an inquiry under my name, but it had not been completed because additional verification was required. And I nodded as if that was a minor detail, even though it was not, because I knew I had not made that request. And that meant someone had tried to take a step forward, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. And when I left the bank, I did not feel panic. I felt confirmation, the kind that settles deep and does not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. And instead of going home, I drove to the small office building on Maple Street where Helen Brooks still practiced, the same Helen who had helped my husband and me years ago when we first drafted our will, the same Helen who had always spoken plainly, without softness, but without cruelty either. And when I walked into her office, she looked up, surprised but not alarmed, as if she could already sense that I was not there for a casual visit. And after a brief greeting, I sat down and told her everything, not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts, the conversation I had overheard, the patterns I had noticed, the request at the bank. And she listened without interrupting, her expression steady, her eyes focused in a way that made me feel, for the first time since this began, that I was not imagining anything, that what I had seen and heard had weight, had structure. And when I finished, she leaned back slightly and asked me a single question, not about my daughter, not about my feelings, but about my documents. When was the last time I had reviewed my will, my medical directives, my power of attorney? And I told her the truth, that it had been years, that I had trusted everything was still in order, that nothing needed to be changed. And she nodded slowly, not with judgment, but with recognition, as if she had seen this situation before in different forms. And she explained, carefully and clearly, that situations like this often depended on timing and assumption, on the belief that nothing had been updated, that everything remained as it was, and that if someone was counting on that, then the simplest way to disrupt their plan was not confrontation, but correction, quiet, legal, undeniable correction. And as she spoke, I felt something settle into place, not fear, not anger, but a kind of direction, a path forward that did not require me to raise my voice or accuse anyone, only to act. And we began reviewing everything, page by page, detail by detail, identifying what needed to be updated, what needed to be protected, what needed to be clarified so there would be no room for interpretation later. And when I left her office that afternoon, the folder in my hand felt heavier than the one I had carried in that morning, not because of the paper inside, but because of what it represented, a shift I had not planned, a role I had not expected to take on. And as I got into my car, I realized that for the first time since I had overheard that sentence, I was no longer reacting to what might happen. I was preparing for what I now knew would. Over the next few days, I moved through my life with a kind of quiet awareness that made everything feel sharper, more deliberate, as if I were seeing my own routines from the outside for the first time, and I kept my interactions with Vanessa exactly the same, answering her calls, responding to her messages, even agreeing when she brought up small adjustments to the travel plans, because I understood now that consistency was the only way to keep her from noticing that anything had changed. And each time she spoke about the trip, her tone carried a subtle urgency beneath the surface, a need to move things forward, to finalize details, to secure the payment. And I let her guide those conversations while I listened more than I spoke, paying attention not just to what she said but to what she avoided, the questions she did not answer directly, the way she would shift topics when specifics came too close to something she did not want to explain. And one afternoon when she stopped by unannounced, carrying a small bag of pastries, as if she were simply being thoughtful, I invited her in and watched as she moved through the house with a familiarity that now felt different, her eyes lingering on things in a way I had not noticed before, the hallway, the staircase, the framed photos on the wall. And when she sat down at the kitchen table, she asked casually if I had given any more thought to organizing my paperwork, mentioning again how important it was to have everything in order, especially with the trip coming up, and I nodded, telling her I had started looking through some things, which was true, though not in the way she expected. And she smiled in a way that seemed satisfied, as if that answer confirmed something for her. And then she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had been researching care options for older adults, not because I needed it now, she added quickly, but because it was smart to plan ahead. And I noticed how carefully she chose her words, how she softened the edges of what she was suggesting, presenting it as concern, as responsibility, as something any good daughter would do. And I responded the way she anticipated, calmly, without resistance, even expressing mild interest, asking what she had found. And as she spoke, describing facilities, amenities, levels of care, I listened without interrupting, letting her talk longer than she probably intended. And in doing so, she revealed more than she realized, mentioning specific places, specific timelines, even approximate costs, details that did not align with the idea of casual research, but with something much more concrete, something already in motion. And I kept my expression neutral, my voice steady, because I understood that this was not the moment to challenge her. This was the moment to gather, to confirm, to let her believe she was still in control of the narrative. And when she finally stood to leave, placing a light hand on my shoulder as she told me not to worry about anything, that she would take care of me, I met her eyes and smiled in return, the same way I always had. But this time the meaning behind that smile was entirely different, because I was no longer reassured by her words. I was measuring them, weighing them against everything I had already learned. And after she left, the house felt quieter than usual, but not empty, not uncertain. Instead, it felt settled, like a space where something had finally become clear. And I walked to the cabinet where I kept my documents, the same place she had suggested I organize, and I opened it slowly, looking at the folders inside, knowing that each piece of paper now held a different kind of significance, not just records of my life, but tools that would determine how the next part of it unfolded. And I realized that while Vanessa believed she was guiding me toward a future she had chosen, she had not considered the possibility that I might choose differently, that I might step out of the path she had laid out and create one of my own. And that quiet realization, more than anything else, was what gave me the certainty I needed to continue exactly as I had been, calm, agreeable, and watching, because the more comfortable she felt, the more she revealed, and I was not finished learning yet. 2 days later, I returned to Helen's office, not because I needed reassurance, but because I needed precision, and this time I brought everything with me. Every document I had gathered, every statement, every record that might matter, and as I sat across from her again, I noticed how different I felt compared to the first visit, less uncertain, more focused, as if the situation had shifted from something happening to me into something I was actively navigating. And Helen reviewed each document with a calm efficiency that left no room for doubt, asking direct questions about access, about beneficiaries, about who was listed where and why, and with each answer I gave, I could see her building a clearer picture, not just of my finances, but of the vulnerabilities Vanessa might be relying on. And when we reached the section on medical directives and power of attorney, Helen paused, looking up at me with a steadiness that made the importance of the moment unmistakable, and she explained that these were often the points where control could be shifted quietly, without confrontation, through paperwork that appeared routine on the surface but carried significant authority underneath. And I felt a brief flicker of something then, not fear, but recognition, because I understood how easily something like that could be presented as helpful, as necessary, as something done out of care rather than strategy. And I told her about the questions Vanessa had asked, about the way she had framed those conversations, and Helen nodded as if she had heard similar stories before, not identical, but close enough that the pattern was familiar, and she began outlining the steps we would take, not dramatic changes, not anything that would draw attention, but adjustments that would ensure clarity, that would remove ambiguity, that would place control firmly where it belonged without needing to announce it. And as she spoke, I realized that what we were doing was not just protecting my assets, it was redefining the structure of my life in a way that no one else could quietly alter. And that realization brought with it a sense of steadiness I had not felt in a long time. And when we finished reviewing everything, Helen handed me a new set of documents, updated, precise, and ready to be signed, and I took them carefully, understanding that these papers represented more than legal formality. They represented a boundary, one that could not be crossed without my consent. And as I signed each page, my name written in the same steady hand it had always been, I felt a quiet shift settle into place, not visible, not dramatic, but real. And when I left her office, the afternoon light felt different, not warmer, not brighter, but clearer, as if the world itself had sharpened slightly around me. And on my drive home, Vanessa called again, her voice carrying that same practiced warmth, asking if I had finalized the payment yet, if everything was ready on my end, and I answered her without hesitation, telling her I would take care of it soon, that everything was moving forward just as planned. And there was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the kind that passes unnoticed if you are not listening for it. But I was, and in that pause I heard confirmation, not of what she said, but of what she expected. And when the conversation ended, I placed my phone down carefully, not with frustration, not with anger, but with a kind of measured calm, because I understood now that while Vanessa believed she was guiding events toward a specific outcome, she had not considered that the foundation beneath that outcome had already been quietly altered. And as I walked back into my house, the same house she had begun to evaluate as something temporary, something transitional, I realized that for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer simply observing her plan. I was standing just outside of it, watching it unfold from a position she did not know I had taken, and that difference, small as it seemed, was everything. The day before the payment was supposed to be made, Vanessa invited me over for dinner again, and this time there was something in the air that felt more settled, more certain, as if she believed everything had already fallen into place. And when I arrived, the house looked exactly as it always did, neat, warm, carefully arranged, but I noticed how she had set the table with a little more effort than usual, how the candles were already lit even though it was still early, how Brian greeted me with a politeness that felt slightly rehearsed, and I stepped into that atmosphere without hesitation, carrying the same calm expression I had practiced, because I understood now that this was not just dinner, this was a moment she had been building toward. And as we sat down, the conversation moved easily at first, small talk, updates about Sophie's school, a mention of the weather, all the ordinary things that create the illusion of normalcy. And then, gradually, Vanessa began guiding the conversation toward the trip, asking if I had finalized the booking, if everything was confirmed, if I needed any help with the last details, and I answered her in a steady tone, telling her that everything was almost ready, that I just needed to complete the payment, and I watched as a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face, quick but unmistakable, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, as if something inside her had relaxed, as if a question she had been holding onto had just been answered, and Brian glanced at her again, that same subtle look I had seen before, not questioning, not challenging, just checking, and I realized then that whatever plan they had, this was the point where they believed it would begin to move forward, and I let the moment settle without interrupting it, because I wanted to see how far she would go when she thought there was nothing left to hide. And after dinner, as we cleared the table together, Vanessa moved closer to me, lowering her voice just slightly, asking if I could transfer the payment the next morning so everything would be secured, explaining that prices could change if we waited, that it was better to lock things in now, and I nodded, agreeing without hesitation, and I could feel the shift in her posture, the subtle easing of tension that comes when someone believes they are in control. And later, as we sat in the living room, Sophie curled up beside me. Vanessa began talking again about the future, not directly, not openly, but through small comments, mentioning how important it was to plan ahead, how people our age needed support systems, how there were places designed to make life easier, safer, more manageable. And I listened, not as a mother hearing concern, but as someone hearing a script that had been carefully prepared, and each word confirmed what I already knew, that this was not a possibility she was considering. It was an outcome she expected, and when I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door, her hand resting lightly on my arm as she reminded me about the payment, her tone warm, reassuring, almost protective, and I met her gaze. With the same calm expression, telling her I would take care of everything first thing in the morning, and as I drove home, the streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that used to make me feel alone but now felt different, like a space where I could think clearly without interruption, and I replayed every moment of the evening, every word, every look, every small detail that confirmed how certain she was, and I understood that by this time tomorrow, she would expect everything to be set in motion, that she would believe the first step of her plan had been completed, and as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment longer than usual, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the moment, to recognize it for what it was, the point just before everything changes. And when I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward my front door, I knew that the next move would not belong to her, no matter how certain she was that it already did. The next morning I woke before the sun had fully risen, the sky still holding that pale gray light that comes just before everything sharpens into day. And for a moment I lay still, listening to the quiet of the house, feeling the weight of what was expected to happen settle into place around me, not as pressure, but as clarity, because I knew exactly what Vanessa believed would take place within the next few hours, and I understood just as clearly what I was actually going to do, and I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately, making coffee, setting my cup on the same spot at the kitchen table, letting everything feel as ordinary as possible, because there was a certain power in normalcy, in not rushing, in not letting urgency dictate my actions the way it was dictating hers. And when I finally sat down with my phone in front of me, I did not open my banking app right away. I simply looked at it for a moment, thinking about how many times I had used it without a second thought, how many times I had transferred money to Vanessa over the years without questioning where it was going or why, and how easily trust had made those decisions feel simple. And then I set the phone aside and reached for the folder Helen had given me, opening it carefully, reviewing each document again, not because I doubted what we had done, but because I wanted to fully understand the position I now held, the structure that had been quietly put into place. And as I turned each page, I felt that same steady sense of control return, the understanding that while Vanessa had been planning for one version of my future, that version no longer existed in the way she believed it did. And when I finished, I closed the folder and placed it back in the cabinet, not hidden, not concealed, just where it belonged. And only then did I pick up my phone again, opening the banking app, navigating to the transfer page, entering the amount she had asked for, the number sitting there on the screen exactly as she expected it would, and I let it remain there for a few seconds, long enough to feel the weight of the decision, long enough to recognize how easy it would be to follow through, to complete the transfer, to let everything continue along the path she had designed. And then I pressed the back button, clearing the screen, closing the app entirely. And in that small, quiet action, something shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, definitively, because I had just stepped out of the role she had written for me. And I set the phone down without hesitation, reaching instead for my keys, because there was still one more thing I needed to do before the day fully unfolded. And as I drove across town, the streets gradually filling with morning traffic, I felt none of the anxiety that might have accompanied this moment in the past, only a focused awareness, the kind that comes when you understand both sides of a situation but choose your own path anyway. And when I arrived at the bank, I went inside without rushing, greeting the same account manager from before, and this time the conversation was even more direct, because now I was not asking questions, I was making decisions, confirming the changes we had discussed, ensuring that every detail was exactly as it needed to be, that every boundary was clearly defined. And when I left, there was nothing left uncertain, nothing left unaddressed. And as I got back into my car, my phone vibrated almost immediately, Vanessa's name appearing on the screen, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, my voice calm as I greeted her, and she asked, without preamble, if the payment had been sent, her tone carrying that same expectation I had come to recognize, and I paused just long enough for the moment to register, not as hesitation, but as intention, before telling her that I had taken care of everything that needed to be done. And there was silence on the other end for just a fraction of a second, the kind of silence that holds more meaning than words. And then she responded with relief, thanking me, telling me she knew she could count on me. And as the call ended, I placed the phone down on the passenger seat, looking out through the windshield at the steady flow of traffic moving past. And I understood that from her perspective, everything was proceeding exactly as planned, that she believed the first step had been completed, that the path ahead was secure, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because what she did not know, what she could not see, was that the foundation she was standing on had already been quietly replaced, and that when the moment came for everything to unfold, it would not move in the direction she expected, no matter how certain she was that it would. By the time evening came, Vanessa had already called twice more, her voice carrying a brightness that felt almost too sharp, too controlled, as if she was trying to keep everything exactly where she wanted it. And I could hear the anticipation underneath it, the quiet certainty that things were finally aligning. And when she asked if I could come over one more time to go through the final travel details, I agreed without hesitation, because I understood that this was the moment she had been building toward, the point where she believed everything was secured. And when I arrived at her house, the atmosphere felt different from before, not just warm, but expectant, like a stage just before a performance begins. And Vanessa greeted me with a smile that lingered just a little too long, her hand resting lightly on my arm as she led me inside. And Brian was already seated at the table, a set of papers in front of him. Not travel documents, not confirmations, but something else, something heavier in tone. And I took my seat without asking questions, allowing them to guide the moment the way they clearly intended to. And Vanessa began speaking in that careful, measured way I had come to recognize, explaining that she had been thinking a lot about my future, about what would be best for me long term, about how important it was to make sure I was taken care of properly. And as she spoke, she slid a folder toward me, her movements calm, deliberate, as if this were a natural next step, as if everything we had discussed about the trip had simply led to this point. And I opened the folder slowly, not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to give the moment the space it required. And inside were documents I recognized immediately, forms related to care arrangements, authorization pages, language about medical decision-making, about residential placement, all presented in a way that made them appear helpful, protective, necessary. And Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice softening as she explained that this was just something to have in place, something to make things easier later, something that would ensure I was in a safe environment if anything ever happened. And I listened without interrupting, letting her finish every sentence, letting her build the justification she had clearly rehearsed. And when she finally paused, looking at me with an expression that combined concern and expectation. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, my hands steady, my voice even as I asked a single question: when exactly she had decided this was necessary. And there was a flicker in her expression then, quick but unmistakable, the kind of reaction that comes when something does not go exactly as planned. But she recovered quickly, explaining that it was just forward thinking, just being responsible, just making sure everything was in order. And I nodded as if I understood, as if her explanation had resolved everything. And then I reached into my bag and placed my own folder on the table, the one Helen had prepared, the one that now defined exactly how my affairs would be handled. And I opened it slowly, turning it toward her so she could see, not dramatically, not forcefully, just clearly. And I told her, in the same calm tone she had been using, that I had already taken care of everything that needed to be arranged, that my documents were updated, that my decisions had been made, and that there was no need for anything additional. And the silence that followed was not loud, not chaotic, but heavy, the kind that settles into a room when expectations begin to unravel. And Vanessa's eyes moved across the pages, her expression shifting in small, controlled ways as she tried to understand what she was seeing. And Brian leaned forward slightly, his earlier certainty replaced with something more uncertain, more cautious. And I sat there, not raising my voice, not accusing, not explaining beyond what was necessary, because I understood that the power of the moment did not come from confrontation. It came from clarity, from the simple fact that the outcome she had been preparing for no longer existed. And as Vanessa finally looked up at me, her composure beginning to slip just enough to reveal the confusion beneath it, I held her gaze steadily, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a calm that made it clear I had seen everything, understood everything, and made my decisions accordingly. And in that moment, without a single raised voice or harsh word, the balance of control shifted completely, not in a way that needed to be announced, but in a way that could not be undone. For a moment, no one spoke, and the silence did not feel accidental. It felt exposed, as if something carefully constructed had been pulled apart without warning. And Vanessa was the first to move, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the table as she glanced back down at the documents in front of her, reading more closely now, not with confidence, but with urgency, as if she were searching for a detail that might restore the direction she had expected. And when she finally spoke, her voice was still controlled, but there was a strain beneath it that had not been there before, asking what exactly I had changed, why I had not told her, why I had gone through all of this without including her. And I listened to each question without interrupting, because I understood that they were not really questions, they were reactions, attempts to reframe a situation that had already shifted beyond her control. And I answered her simply, telling her that I had reviewed my affairs and made decisions that felt right for me, that everything was clear, documented, and legally in place, and that there was nothing left uncertain. And Brian shifted in his chair then, his earlier silence replaced by a cautious attempt to understand, asking whether this meant the trip was still happening, whether everything we had planned was still on track. And I turned to him briefly, my tone steady as I explained that I had not made any payment, that nothing had been finalized, and that I had chosen to wait. And that was when Vanessa's composure cracked, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that could not be hidden, her eyes narrowing slightly, her posture tightening, the calm tone she had been maintaining slipping just enough to reveal the frustration underneath. And she asked why I would do that, why I would delay something we had already agreed on, why I would complicate what should have been simple. And I met her gaze without raising my voice, telling her that I no longer made decisions based on what was simple for someone else, that I made them based on what was clear for me. And the words settled between us in a way that did not need to be emphasized, because their meaning was already understood. And she leaned back slightly, crossing her arms in a gesture that felt more defensive than she probably intended. And for the first time since I had arrived, the balance in the room was no longer centered around her, and I could see it in the way she looked at Brian, not for confirmation this time, but for support. And he hesitated, his expression uncertain, as if he had stepped into something he did not fully understand. And I realized then that whatever version of this plan he had been part of, he had not expected it to unfold this way. And that realization did not change anything for me, but but it clarified the dynamics even further, and Vanessa spoke again, her tone sharper now, asking if I was accusing her of something, if I was suggesting that she had done anything wrong. And I shook my head slightly, not dismissively, but firmly, telling her that I was not accusing her of anything, that I was simply making sure my life remained in my control, and that everything I had done was about clarity, not conflict. And that seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation would have, because there was nothing for her to argue against, nothing to defend, no direct confrontation she could push back on, and the room fell quiet again. But this time the silence felt different, not uncertain, not exposed, but settled, as if something had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be forced. And I gathered my folder slowly, placing the documents back inside with the same care I had used before, and as I stood, neither of them moved to stop me. Neither of them offered another explanation or question, and I paused for a moment, looking at Vanessa not as someone I needed to convince or confront, but as someone whose intentions I had finally seen clearly. And I told her, in the same calm tone I had maintained throughout, that I would always take care of myself first, and that nothing about my future would be decided without me again. And then I turned and walked toward the door, not in a hurry, not with hesitation, but with a steadiness that did not require acknowledgement, because the conversation we had just had was not one that needed to continue. It had already said everything it needed to say. When I stepped outside, the night air felt steady, not cold, not warm, just clear, and I paused on the front porch for a moment before walking to my car. Not because I was unsure of what I had just done, but because I wanted to feel it fully, the quiet shift that had taken place, the kind that does not announce itself but changes everything all the same. And as I drove home, the streets looked the same as they always had, the same houses, the same lights in the windows, the same rhythm of a neighborhood settling in for the night. But something inside me no longer moved in that same rhythm. Something had realigned, something I had carried for years without questioning. And when I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I did not rush to get out. I simply sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle around me. And for the first time in a long time, it did not feel heavy. It felt earned, and I thought about everything that had led to this moment, not just the conversation tonight, but the years before it, the choices I had made without hesitation, the ways I had stepped aside to make space for someone else, believing that love meant giving without measure, without boundary, without condition. And I understood now that what I had called love had often been permission for someone else to decide what was best for me, to shape my life in ways I had never agreed to, simply because I had never said no. And that realization did not come with regret. It came with clarity, the kind that does not ask you to look backward, only forward. And when I finally stepped out of the car and walked into my house, I moved through each room slowly, noticing details I had overlooked before, the quiet strength of the place, the way it held my history without needing to be explained or justified. And I understood then that this space was not something temporary, not something waiting to be replaced. It was something I had built, something I had maintained, something that belonged to me in a way no one else could redefine. And I set my keys down on the counter, placing them in the same spot I always did. But even that small action felt different, not automatic, but intentional. And I walked to the cabinet where my documents were kept, opening it briefly, not to check anything, but simply to see it, to recognize that everything inside had been put in place by my own decision, not someone else's plan. And I closed it again with a quiet sense of finality, because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left uncertain. And in the days that followed, Vanessa did not call as often, and when she did, her tone was different, more cautious, less certain, as if she were trying to understand a situation that no longer followed the path she had expected. And I responded the same way I always had, calm, polite, but no longer accommodating in the way she relied on. And that difference, subtle as it was, reshaped everything between us without a single argument, without a single raised voice. And I did not need to explain it. I did not need to defend it, because it was not something she could negotiate or reinterpret. It was simply the way things were now. And as I stood in my kitchen one morning, sunlight coming through the window in that familiar, steady way, I realized that nothing in my life had been taken from me, not my home, not my independence, not my ability to choose what came next, because those things had never belonged to anyone else in the first place, and I had simply allowed someone to believe they did. And I let that thought settle, not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a quiet truth I would carry forward. And I poured myself a cup of coffee, sitting down at the table where so many decisions had once been made without my voice, and I took a slow sip, letting the moment remain exactly as it was, unhurried, unpressured, entirely my own. And for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like I had already arrived exactly where I needed to be.